Gentleman is recognized for a total of 3 minutes.
I thank both gentlemen for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the rule and in support of H.J. Res. 373, the Solomon resolution to disapprove the extension of MFN status for China. I do not often agree with my Republican friend from upstate New York, but he's right on this issue, and I'm happy to work with him on it. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue of human rights and foreign policy, and it is important to us for that reason. But it is also an issue dealing with the loss of American jobs and the lowering of our standard of living, and for that reason, it should also be of concern to every member of Congress. Mr. Speaker, multinational corporations and the big business community have launched a huge lobbying effort to preserve MFN status for China, claiming that their investments create American jobs. Unfortunately, they are wrong, very wrong. While it is true that the huge multinationals like Chrysler, AT&T, and Boeing and others can in fact make huge profits by investing in China, it is not true that those investments improve the standard of living of the average American worker. In fact, the opposite is the case. Mr. Speaker, when multinational corporations throw American workers out on the street and move to China, where workers are paid 15 cents an hour, where slave labor exists, where basic democratic rights are ignored, where workers cannot organize free trade unions, that scenario may be good for the profit margins of the large corporations, but it is a disaster for American workers. It is absurd to be talking about most favored nation status for a country which allows for the ruthless exploitation of its workers. American workers cannot and must not be asked to compete against the workers in China who in many instances are working under subhuman conditions. I know that this is a very radical idea, but maybe, just maybe, we might want to encourage American corporations to reinvest in this country for decent jobs and decent wages for our workers, rather than in China, where they pay workers $2 or $3 for a day's work. We are told by the Commerce Department that the $9 billion a year in exports from the U.S. to China generates 225,000 American jobs. But if this is correct, then what is the effect of the over $30 billion a year in imports from China, over 3 times the level of exports? Strangely enough, the Commerce Department hasn't been able to calculate that figure. And I think the reason is clear. It would show that our massive $24 billion trade deficit with China is costing hundreds of thousands of Americans their jobs. When Chinese students and workers were violently suppressed in Tiananmen Square, Americans and people all over the world were horrified.
Chair recognizes the gentleman. The gentleman is recognized for 30 additional seconds.
Politicians vowed to act swiftly and strongly to preserve China, pressure China to stop its repression. But although the repression goes on, American corporations have decided to put profits ahead of human rights. In fact, between 1988 and 1992, U.S. corporations increased their investments fourfold. Mr. Speaker, let us support the Solomon resolution. Let us tell China that they cannot continue their types of policies. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Yes, sir. You mentioned about the imports of steel.
Yeah.
I'd like to allude to that. We hear from the American steel industry that in Japan, for instance, steel producers are producing at less than cost with support of the government so as to keep employment up there. And as a result, the American steel industry here is not going to be able to compete. So they're going to shut down, and we're going to have higher unemployment here. What is your answer to that?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a very easy answer. Because I may say the answer I'm giving is not my answer. It was the answer that was given by Adam Smith, the man whose face appears on my tie, I may say. It was given by Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations. From that time to this, hardly any professional economist has believed in tariffs or protection or anything but free trade. But the answer is very straightforward. Let us suppose for a moment that the Japanese flood us with steel. That will reduce employment in the American steel industry, no doubt. However, it will increase employment elsewhere in America. We will pay for that steel with dollars. What will the Japanese do with the dollars they get for the steel? They aren't going to burn them. They aren't going to tear them up. If they would, that would be best of all. Because there's nothing we can produce more cheaply than green pieces of paper. And if they were willing to send us steel and just take back green pieces of paper, I can't imagine a better deal. But they're not going to do that. They're not stupid. They're smart people. They're going to use those dollars to buy goods and services. They're going to spend them. In the process of spending them, they may spend them directly in the United States, and that directly provides employment in the United States. They may spend them in Brazil or in Germany or in China or anywhere else. But whoever gets them in turn is going to spend them. So the dollars that we spend for the steel will find their way back to the U.S. as demand for U.S. goods and services. You will have less employment in the steel industry. You will have more employment in the industries producing the goods we export. Overall, total employment will not be affected. But overall, the American consumer will be benefited because he will get the steel more cheaply and the goods made from the steel more cheaply than he otherwise would. That's the benefit to the American consumer. Now, why is the steel industry and similar industries, why are they so effective in their campaigns for protection? Because of a very common problem that affects not only this but lots else. And that is the difference between the visible and the invisible. The people who are going to lose their jobs in steel are very visible. They're a collective group. You can name their names. Suppose we restrict imports from Japan. Then people are going to lose their jobs in these export industries. They will be widely spread over the country. You and I couldn't name one person. But that doesn't mean they're any less real. But the greater propaganda effect of the steel industry is because you can set the visible is a more potent political force than the invisible people who will lose their jobs. I urge on those people who think there's some sense to the steel industry argument to consider it in a more absurd setting. You very often bring out the logic of an argument by carrying it to an extreme. You know, you could have a great employment in the city of Logan, Utah, of people growing bananas in hothouses. If we had a high enough tariff on the import of bananas, it could become profitable to build hothouses and grow bananas in those hothouses. That would give employment. Would that be a sensible thing to do? If that isn't sensible, then neither is it sensible to artificially restrict the import of steel. Now, with respect to the charge that the Japanese government is subsidizing the export of steel, number one, is very dubious that it's true, but suppose it were true. Then that would be a foolish thing for the Japanese to do from their own point of view. But why should we object to their giving us foreign aid? We've given them quite a bit. Thank you.
The other members here, Secretary Mnuchin.
I don't blame the other countries. When I was in China, I said, listen, President Xi, I have a lot of respect for President Xi. I said, I don't blame you. If you're able to get away with making almost $500 billion a year off of our country, how could I blame you? Somebody agreed to these deals. And those people should be ashamed of themselves, what they've let happen. So we're bringing it back, and we're going to bring it back relatively rapidly, and we're going to be... One priority is paramount: reversing decades of calamitous trade policies. So bad. We are now making it clear to China that after years of targeting our industries and stealing our intellectual property, the theft of American jobs and wealth has come to an end.